I hope my paintings will last without cracking. I would like to appear before the young painters of the year 2000 with butterfly wings.
Across the globe, in the world's biggest museums, Pierre Bonnard's paintings have stood the test of time. The man who wanted to bring alive painting created work that was timeless, as if suspended. Pierre Bonnard was known as the painter of happiness and spent his life painting intimate scenes. His canvases are explosions of colour which embellish reality and bring out the sacred quality of light. Straddling two eras and constantly bucking the trend, he rejected all the theories and went his own way. He made work that was both remarkable and unclassifiable. And yet, hiding behind his colourful paintings was a melancholic, lonely, and solitary man. Obsessed by colour and a perfectionist, he was ferociously hard on himself. Only by immersing ourselves in his work can we begin to understand quite how complex and private Pierre Bonnard was. Nothing in Pierre Bonnard's history hints at the fact that he would one day become a painter who was obsessed with colour and with conveying sensuality, humanity, and nature in his paintings. He was born in Fontenay-aux-Roses one morning in the autumn of 1867 in the countryside just outside Paris. His father Eugène was a civil servant in the War Ministry. His mother Elizabeth was a housewife. The family lived an ordinary bourgeois life in this small suburban house. There was no extravagance or folly. Pierre grew up with his head in his books, studying Latin and Greek. He developed his keen eye for his surroundings elsewhere, on contact with nature. Each year, he went with his family to Le Grande, a small village in Isère in the foothills of the Alps. He spent many happy and carefree summers in this sprawling family home.
It was a happy house. These were times he spent with his parents, grandparents, and siblings. They were times for sharing and discovery, for sensory delights. He had fond memories of family holidays at Le Grande Lamps.
The villagers would congregate in the streets and cafes. Surrounded by grown-ups, Pierre was a very reserved and discreet boy, quietly observing what went on around him. In 1881, at the age of 14, he found a way of expressing himself. He started doing little sketches. Soon, despite never having had any lessons, Pierre was showing a facility for drawing his parents and the people who crossed his path.
From his first drawings, it is clear that he had a good eye and the skill to capture the intricate details of village life and its inhabitants. He knew how to convey an atmosphere and people's emotions and feelings.
sait saisir l'émotion des sentiments autour de ces personnages.
Little by little, he discovered his surroundings for himself. The luscious vegetation, the golden cornfields, and the colourful landscapes were etched on his memory. He would lose himself in the surrounding woods and experience nature through the eyes of a child.
He painted a lot of country scenes, Dauphiné landscapes, animals, cows, goats, images of twisted tree trunks, rabbits, hamsters, frogs. He was close to nature, and I think he liked walking in the woods.
Pierre clearly had a gift for drawing. But no one ever imagined he could make a living out of it. His father had big plans for him and couldn't envisage him having anything other than a respectable career. Pierre was a taciturn teenager who buried himself in his drawings. However, Pierre Bonnard was somehow convinced he would make a good lawyer.
Naturally, his father wanted him to study law, so he sent his son to university at the Sorbonne. That was obviously quite common in bourgeois circles.
In 1885, Pierre turned 18. After sitting his baccalaureate, he moved to Paris and spent his days in the lecture theatres of the prestigious Sorbonne. The atmosphere was studious, but the young man was not very focused on his studies. He could think only of drawing. So a few months later, this law student timidly pushed open the doors to the École des Beaux-Arts. There he discovered another world with an artistic sensibility and creativity that he could relate to. Every day, after revising for his law exams, he'd put on a smock, grab his tubes of colour and head for the École des Beaux-Arts. He was so enthused it took him no time at all to fit in with the other students. He was soon part of a new family composed of fellow artists, Paul Lheritier, Edouard Vuillard, and several others. Young rebel artists.
Aged 18 to 25, these bearded, long-haired youngsters spent their time drawing, having fun, and painting.
But however captivated he was by his new artist friends, Pierre Bonnard was bored stiff in class.
At the École des Beaux-Arts, they were taught academic theories and to respect the hierarchy of artists. They studied the great masters from antiquity up to the early 19th century. So a great deal of attention was paid to lineage and to theoretic and academic principles.
The students had had enough of having to produce history paintings depicting bombastic figures who adopted the stance of ancient heroes.
Disappointed, the young Pierre longed to rediscover the thrill of afternoons spent in the woods as a child. But in 1888, at the age of 21, he saw a small painting which re-motivated him and changed his relationship with nature and colour forever. It had been painted by Paul Lheritier, one of his friends from the École des Beaux-Arts. It's an amazing story. A few weeks previously, in midsummer, Paul Lheritier had been on holiday in Pont-Aven in Brittany. At the boarding house where he stayed, he met an artist in his 40s, Paul Gauguin. Gauguin, who was still unknown at the time and penniless, grew fond of the young Paul Serusier. He wanted to help him develop his observational skills and style. The two men sat in front of a very simple landscape, a wood and a river. And Paul Serusier started painting, listening carefully to Gauguin's instructions.
It's a tiny painting, rapidly executed on the lid of a cigar box forming a wooden panel. Paul Gauguin had dictated to him how to paint it.
Gauguin had said to him, "How do you see those trees? You see yellow, so paint them yellow. How do you see that leaf? Red, so use vermilion." Gauguin dictated the colours, so he ended up with a landscape full of very bold colours that were completely unrealistic. He used red, blue, green and yellow, which are very distinct colours. The colours are pure. They haven't been mixed. And this was a time when artists painted in dull colours.
That summer, the genial Paul Gauguin gave him some invaluable advice.
Art is an abstraction. Take inspiration from nature and think of the creative process rather than the result.
On his return to Paris, Paul Serusier took his friends aside in the corridors of the École des Beaux-Arts and discreetly took out this small painting as if it were a hidden treasure. The painting was passed around. When Pierre Bonnard leant over it, he was speechless. He was bowled over by these bold, abstract blocks of bright colours, by this unrealistic but expressive landscape.
The students were all filled with enthusiasm for the bold colours and the simplicity of this small painting, which became a sort of talisman. It revealed to them what nature could look like if you dared to heighten the tones. Gauguin was quick to understand that these young artists were the new generation who wanted to take risks. This was something new for them. Here was a doorway, a portal even, for them to go through. It opened up new possibilities.
The possibilities were endless. Bonnard and his friends started to rebel against the over-strict theories at the École des Beaux-Arts. One evening, at 28 Rue Pigalle, over an animated discussion, they started their own movement. They set up a group called Les Nabis, which means prophets in Hebrew.
They sometimes met in secret, presenting their new works and reading texts. They held initiation ceremonies for new members.
This was a spiritual brotherhood of about a dozen young artists who wanted to celebrate colour and simplify forms. At the meetings, they all showed their paintings and discussed new ideas. Paul Serusier took the simplification process further. He attempted a new style of painting with pared-down forms. Edouard Vuillard turned to abstraction. Within this group, painting took on new meaning for Pierre Bonnard. Becoming a painter became a necessity. In 1889, he painted his first self-portrait. What he was saying about himself was radical.
His eyes are dark and quite piercing, and his gaze is direct, staring out from behind his small round glasses. In his hand, he is holding paintbrushes and a palette. This painting is almost like an identity card. With it, he is saying, "I am a painter. I have decided to become a painter." It is as if he is taking his vows as a painter. Instead of becoming a lawyer, he has decided to become a painter.
With this painting, Pierre Bonnard is drawing a line under his intended career as a lawyer. He has always been hesitant and a bit withdrawn, but now he seems more self-assured than ever. At the age of 22, he has chosen freedom.
What he wants is to be free. He wants to be an artist. He's wanted that all along. Like any young man, he's rebelling against his father and against the establishment. He wants to be free. He wants to be able to do what he likes doing and what he feels he does best. And that's painting.
In 1890, he found somewhere to work. He set up his first studio in Rue Le Chapelet in Batignolles, taking his first step towards freedom. Through this life as an artist that he had long dreamed of, Bonnard discovered a Paris that was unpredictable and liberated. The Paris of Montmartre and its bohemians. Café life at Le Chat Noir and Le Petit Poucet on Place Clichy. The buzz of Pigalle with its new cabarets, which were flourishing and livening up Parisian nights. This bustling nightlife provided him with a new subject matter.
This was the Paris of wild parties, the Paris of the Moulin Rouge, of the newly built Eiffel Tower, of the World Fair, of the metro, of horse-drawn carriages, of crinoline dresses.
This was a place not of debauchery, but of pleasure and fun. This was somewhere it was possible to live the Bohemian life, and that's the life that Pierre Bonnard wanted to discover. He might have seemed like a sensible man, but he was attracted to that lifestyle.
Assez raisonnable, mais je pense qu'il est attiré par cette vie-là.
In these streets teeming with life, his curiosity was boundless. The young painter drew everything around him. Passers-by and Montmartre street scenes. Always on the lookout for something new to feed his work, he trawled museums and galleries, his curious gaze lingering. Then one day in 1890, he and his fellow Nabis witnessed an event which, over the next few months, would take the Parisian art world by storm. A major exhibition of Japanese art.
Évidemment, c'est une immense révélation.
This exhibition was a huge revelation to the artists. The sheer number and vast array of works on show made a real impact, not only on the more academic artists, but also on all these artists of the avant-garde.
Seulement les artistes plus académiques, mais bien sûr pour tous ces artistes de l'avant-garde.
This liberated, expressive use of colour was a real revelation for a whole generation.
The whole of Paris was mesmerised. The Nabis were there, but also Manet, Degas, Renoir and Paul Gauguin. They discovered more than 700 Japanese prints by Hokusai, Hiroshige and Outamaro. A real sight for sore eyes.
What the artists took from these prints was this very precise outline of each figure, a relatively sinuous line, which we later see in paintings by Pierre Bonnard. The Japanese also used very decorative geometric patterns, which Pierre Bonnard loved. It's not for nothing that he became known as the Nabis japonais.
Along with everyone else, Pierre Bonnard was bowled over by the audacity of this simplified line. But something else disturbed him. He had a very strong affinity with the philosophy of these Japanese artists. Hokusai's gentle approach to nature. His strong, almost mystical connection with the elements. Pierre was fascinated by the Great Wave and 36 views of Mount Fuji. He had finally found paintings depicting the natural charm that he had found so moving in the countryside of his childhood.
There is definitely a spiritual dimension to Japanese art, especially in these contemplative paintings of nature.
The graphic arts were very important to Bonnard at the start of his career, helping him to pursue a very radical, modern style of painting.
The young painter's work changed radically after that. His lines became simplified. His backgrounds and volumes were replaced by more abstract forms. Pierre Bonnard unlearned what he had been taught, and when he started painting the female figure, he did so as simply as possible.
Women feature prominently in the young Bonnard's work. These were the carefree Parisian women he bumped into. He chose and hired his models for their simplicity and their spontaneity. That's the feeling we get from the first female figures to appear in his paintings.
Surprisingly, just as the young painter seemed to be finding his style, it was a commission for an advert that gave him his first breakthrough. In 1891, he was commissioned by France Champagne to make an advertising poster. He drew on his recent influences, taking inspiration from Hokusai and the Parisian women he frequented to make a groundbreaking poster.
It's an advert for champagne, depicted by a frivolous young woman who has had a fair bit to drink, so she's a bit tipsy. There are bubbles bursting all over the place, and her glass is overflowing. It shows that very French joie de vivre coupled with refinement that champagne represents. It's a very successful poster with very little colour, predominantly yellow, like champagne, and it was to follow Bonnard throughout his career until the end of his life.
It's very modern because this was a time when posters didn't attempt to convey any depth. They were completely flat.
He got 100 francs for that commission. That was a substantial amount at the time. His poster went up all over Paris, forcing his father to express his admiration. At the age of 24, Pierre had had his first breakthrough.
When his father learned that his son had landed his first contract, he danced in the garden. It was delightful. The father was thrilled at his son's success. It was a first step.
But Bonnard was attracted to something more than the money or the recognition. The poster was made using a mechanized printing technique, lithography. This machine printed in layers, colour by colour. So the choice of shades of colour was important. From bright colours to pure black, the young painter learned to find the perfect tone.
Les artistes sont obligés de travailler couleur par couleur.
The artists were obliged to work colour by colour, which led them to rediscover colour, to quote Bonnard. Obviously, he could only focus on the yellow parts when he wanted to use yellow, then the pink parts, and then the black parts. Working monochromatically forced him to reflect on the effects of each colour.
While Pierre was experimenting with lithography at his printers, a young painter in his 20s was searching all over for him in the streets of Montmartre. Henri Toulouse-Lautrec was a young, out-of-work illustrator who was impressed by the France Champagne poster and desperate to meet its creator.
Pierre Bonnard lui a dit très simplement, écoute, viens avec moi, je vais te présenter à mon imprimeur.
Pierre Bonnard simply said to him, "Listen, come with me. I'll introduce you to my printer." And so he invited him to go and see his printer. The printer was delighted and challenged them both to create a poster for the Moulin Rouge. Pierre Bonnard and Toulouse-Lautrec both rose to the challenge, but Toulouse-Lautrec won the competition, which was the start of a successful career designing publicity posters. He made over 400 posters and prints in his life. Pierre Bonnard seemed to make way for Toulouse-Lautrec, as if it was obvious to him that it was in Toulouse-Lautrec's interest to go down that route.
Pierre Bonnard never challenged Henri Toulouse-Lautrec's position as the leading poster artist, since shortly afterwards he met someone who would turn his life and work upside down. In 1893, quite by chance in the street, Pierre met Marthe de Méligny, a slender woman with long hair and piercing eyes. She was wild and mysterious, as well as beautiful, and Pierre fell head over heels in love with her. He was 26 and she was 24.
Ça se passait sur le boulevard Haussmann.
It happened on Boulevard Haussmann during rush hour. The roads were full of carriages, cars and buses, all racing past at breakneck speed. And Marthe was attempting to cross the road, oblivious to the risks she was taking. Pierre Bonnard, who had been strolling around Paris, taking it all in, just happened to be passing, and he saved her. She was pretty and quite slight. The sort of woman you want to paint. I can see why Pierre was so smitten.
In her company, the timid boy became a confident man who was asserting himself as a painter. After their first nights as lovers, Pierre Bonnard painted his first nudes. The blocks of colour were gone. These were the idealised forms of a sensual body. This painting, The Indolent Woman, is an erotic masterpiece.
He was in love. And like all lovers, he had a muse. We see Marthe naked in the sheets, just after making love. She seems to be reaching a climax in the painting.
He is unveiling her. The curves of her body are uncovered, and he is taking the liberty of painting them. Perhaps it is Marthe's naked body which leads him to want to use colour to create volume. Through Marthe, he discovered what it meant for a man and a woman to be in love. That was very visible in his painting. There followed other major works like The Indolent Woman, such as Man and Woman. This was an important phase in his work, this subdued, sombre eroticism. You can imagine that this was after a love-making session. She is playing with the cats while the man is getting dressed. He is very vertical, and this would have had a strong impact in its day. This picture, painted in 1900, must have been quite shocking for some.
The couple moved into a small apartment in Montmartre. Time stopped still when he was with her. He would get up at dawn and discover a new light every day, delicately resting on Martyrs' skin. He started painting that light. Marthe didn't sit for him. She simply lived beside him. Pierre Bonnard's work came alive. He painted numerous nude portraits of this woman he had fallen madly in love with.
He sketched Marthe washing, Marthe in the bathtub, Martha putting on her stockings, always intimate scenes.
Dans des scènes donc toujours intimes. Et puis il rentrait.
Then, he would shut himself in his studio and spend his time painting Martha from his sketches, under artificial light.
Cette Marthe qu'il avait croquée.
The colour in his paintings became more and more intense. It was no longer a question of following trends or responding to outside influences. He became a painter of intimate scenes. He is now recognised more for that work than for any other. In 1896, 3 years after meeting Martha, Pierre had his first one-man show in a very influential art gallery. He was 29 and his career as a painter had been launched. But as well as providing a turning point in Pierre Bonnard's work, Martha was also responsible for isolating the artist. As well as being beautiful, she was emotionally disturbed. She became jealous and increasingly intolerant of Pierre's friends. Gradually, the two lovers cut themselves off from the thriving artistic community in Montmartre. And although his popularity was soaring and his paintings were bang on trend, Pierre Bonnard suddenly left Paris.
Pierre Bonnard va s'éloigner de Paris.
Pierre Bonnard moved out of Paris in 1900, at a time when the capital was in a state of excitement. That was the year of the World Fair, and numerous artistic trends were emerging.
Et on croise de très nombreuses tendances artistiques.
Finalement, Pierre va quitter Paris.
Pierre finally left Paris. Leaving Paris is a high price to pay when you are an artist. In those days, everything happened in Paris. And Pierre had started out in Paris.
What's more, in 1900, Martha started having health problems.
She was a very fragile woman who might have suffered from tuberculosis. That was never known for sure, but she was always of a delicate constitution. She was so tiny and slight. They spent their lives in seaside resorts and spa towns.
Une vie en effet un petit peu.
They lived rather a reclusive life. They stayed in their hotel room, and he would set up a studio space in the room. She seemed to be cutting him off from the world, but it provided him with an excellent excuse to paint.
Pierre accompanied Martha from town to town. This period of roaming around was to last 25 years. In his isolation on these trips, he reconnected with nature, which he had really missed, and he painted non-stop. These endless trips across France were made possible thanks to a contract he had signed with some major art dealers. Pierre was now a famous painter. He regularly sent new paintings back to Paris, which were then sold in Europe or in the United States. Then one day, the south of France. Its strong light pierced the landscape. Pierre Bonnard was bowled over.
Quand il va découvrir en tout cas celle de...
He was dazzled by the light in the south of France. He had finally found the light that suited him, and that light warmed up his paintings again.
Je pense que c'est une lumière qui va réchauffer tous ces tableaux.
Donc Bonnard, lorsqu'il découvre la Côte d'Azur,
When Bonnard discovered the Côte d'Azur, he wrote to his mother, "It's like something from the Arabian Nights." That says it all. He was totally seduced by this sunlight, which helped him to relax and become hedonistic, something he had never experienced before. He became very adept at living this much more relaxed lifestyle. And obviously, being a painter, he also discovered colours and vegetation, motifs which would seduce him completely.
Pierre Bonnard found a house in the middle of this golden landscape, which was to become his final landing place. Le Cannet, just above the Bay of Cannes. In 1927, at the age of 60, Pierre and his wife settled in this villa, which they called Lebowski. It was a discreet house, bathed in sunlight and set in the middle of a beautiful garden. Here, the artist idealized his day-to-day life, creating his most beautiful paintings.
Financially, he could have had a much bigger villa, more spacious and opulent, but he bought a relatively modest villa. The paint was peeling off the walls in places. It was hardly the height of luxury, but he didn't attach much importance to the walls of this house, and when we see them in the paintings, they are like jewels.
It was a very small house, but he turned it into something from the Arabian Nights. There appears to be an explosion of colours in the house, but that was all in Bonnard's imagination.
Pierre Bonnard lived here very simply. The rooms were small and sparsely furnished. A dining room, Martyr's bedroom, which the painter never entered, and his bedroom, adorned with a bed bathed in sunlight. With age, Martha had become ever more exclusive. She couldn't tolerate anyone anymore, and barely even spoke to her husband. Pierre had a bathtub installed for her. They were hard to come by in those days. Martha spent hours in the water, soothing the pain that was gnawing away at her. In this new house, the artist painted his muse as obsessively as in the early days, as if making up for lost time. With this very special light came new skin tones and forms. On painting after painting, he idealized her body, just that little bit more each time. It was a sign of his devotion that Martha never aged on his canvases. She didn't sit for him. The paintings are the memory, a sensation, of a fleeting moment or posture, a trace of their lovemaking. Like a stoic or monk, Pierre Bonnard had the same ritual every day.
Every morning he went walking in the hills overlooking the Canal de la Seine, which flowed just above his house. His notebooks contain his comments about the weather, whether it was raining, windy or sunny. And then, on little pieces of paper, he drew the hills surrounding Le Cannet and Cannes harbour.
He would transcribe onto his canvases an internal vision from behind his eyes, which did not correspond to the things he saw. It's very important to understand that about Bonnard. He reinvented life, but he drew inspiration from the outside world. He would be moved by a flash of sunlight, and he would then want that flash of sunlight to come out in his paintings, so he would remember it and use it.
He had to experience the light in the landscape to create that harmony.
Day after day, he patiently contemplated the world around him. In notebooks, he jotted down a few simple lines. Often, he simply described the weather. After this almost religious ceremony, he would return home. pin a canvas directly to his wall, and paint his memories, an imaginary and fantasy world. Sometimes he would paint the view from his house. In Studio with Mimosa, once again, it is a transformed reality which he has created with his brushes.
Son atelier minuscule.
His studio was tiny, but when you see Studio with Mimosa, it's as though the mimosa is growing inside the apartment, causing an explosion of colour. It really does look magical.
In the 1930s, the days at Le Cannet were spent in a monotony guided by a spiritual quest, a reflection on the artist's response to nature. Pierre Bonnard had only one objective: to keep painting these sublime landscapes as he saw them.
He was an innocent man. He was never driven by money. He just wanted to paint. He wanted to paint what he saw and to breathe life into paint. He always said, "I do not want to paint life. I want to bring paint alive and show how beautiful the world is." He did his own thing. He painted happiness. He painted what he wanted to paint, impervious to outside influences.
This monastic existence was a far cry from the lifestyle of the influential artists of the day. Over 900 kilometers from Le Cannet in Paris, it was a different story. Since the 1920s, new artists had been appearing on the scene, making a case for the avant-garde. Fauvism, Cubism, and then Surrealism. Movements which reinvented art by distorting reality. A modernist vision far removed from that of Pierre Bonnard. For artists like Picasso, Bonnard had become old school.
Picasso thought that Bonnard was a potpourri of indecision. His paintings were too sensitive and not combative enough. Picasso was hungry for power, whereas Bonnard had a different rhythm to his life. He didn't have the same approach to life. Life wasn't a battle for him. He had different priorities. He was more interested in experimenting with colour and light than trying to seize the power.
Bonnard swam against the tide. His paintings were unlike any others, and he was not affiliated to any movement. Although cut off from the Paris scene, he made friends with the leader of the Fauvist movement, Henri Matisse. For about a decade, the two men corresponded, revealing a mutual admiration for their respective artistic quests. In this letter, Pierre Bonnard gives a rare account of his philosophy of life.
On my morning walks, I delight in listing the different types of landscape paintings. Intimate landscapes, decorative landscapes, etc. But as for the view, I see different things every day. The sky and objects, everything is constantly changing. It can be overwhelming, but it's what makes us feel alive.
Despite his apparent serenity, the criticism affected him. The artist was wavering. In Paris, painting was seen as an outdated art form. Doubting this art form challenged Pierre Bonnard's entire existence. The first doubts took hold.
There was a gradual move away from the plastic arts towards a far more conceptual art form, and Bonnard was sensing that.
Peut-être il sent que,
Perhaps he felt that he was the dinosaur of painting and that everyone else was moving on to something else. He felt misunderstood and a bit lonely.
In 1931, at the age of 64, he painted a series of sombre and tortured self-portraits. He lived for painting, but it was becoming a daily struggle. When he painted himself as a boxer, Pierre Bonnard was expressing the battle he was fighting daily against himself.
He painted himself as a boxer to show that painting was a struggle, despite the fact that he wasn't a power-hungry artist. He was having doubts when he painted these self-portraits. They are very strong paintings, especially one of the later ones, where we see the oval of his face in the mirror, his eyes like two dark slits, whereas before they had been so expressive, his weapons and his tools. He doesn't have a faraway look on his face. He doesn't have any look at all. His eyes are black. It's as if he is reflecting back on himself, looking in on himself and his situation as a painter.
He was becoming ever more introspective. He was increasingly obsessed by colour and getting exactly the right tone. He wanted to achieve perfection. In his studio, he had several canvases on the go at once, some of them for years. Never satisfied, he kept touching them up, covering up any imperfections, sometimes embarking on crazy manoeuvres. One day in 1938, aged 71, he swept into the Musée de Luxembourg, where one of his paintings was on display.
Suddenly, on seeing his painting, despite the fact that it was hanging in a museum, he decided that something wasn't quite right. He always had a small box of watercolour paints on him, and he asked a friend to distract the museum attendant so he could add a few finishing touches to his painting.
Bonnard's paintings were never quite finished. Sometimes he hung on to a painting for 40 or 50 years. His painting was still there, and he was still touching it up.
In January 1942, Martyr died. Pierre became even more withdrawn.
On the day she died, he simply drew a cross in his diary.
He had shut the door, and it seemed he would never open it again.
At the age of 75, painting was all he had left. He carried on painting imaginary landscapes as if to remain cut off from the world. He spent his final years seeking wisdom. In his paintings, in colours, in the light, in the landscape. Hokusai had Mount Fuji. Pierre Bonnard had his almond tree. From his bedroom window, he watched it flower, fade, and flower again. He painted it every year, rediscovering a sense of fullness and tranquility. The seasons passed, and the man aged. He felt he had achieved his life's objective, to be at one with nature.
The almond tree is a subject that seems to stem from a Japanese philosophy. The almond tree is a flowering tree. It represents rebirth. Painting a portrait of this tree was like painting his own portrait. There is this harmony between nature and the man. The man has merged with the almond tree. Moreover, almond tree in blossom was his last painting. He felt there was far too much green in the bottom left-hand corner of the painting, so he wanted to add some yellow. Naturally, he didn't really have the strength anymore to add the yellow, so he asked his nephew to add it for him, because his nephew did a bit of painting. So his nephew helped him to add that touch of yellow.
I would say that Bonnard was a believer. We mentioned spirituality earlier, but what did he believe in? In the beauty of the world, in the light, in the way that it transforms everything. That was Bonnard.
Ça, c'est Bonnard.
Pierre Bonnard died aged 80 in 1947 in his house in Lheritier, amidst the abundant vegetation which grew up around his studio. Nature had reasserted itself. The artist spent 60 years painting every day without exception. When he died, he left behind him a body of paintings which are more alive than ever.